Hello, and welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. My name is Kristen McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. This is our final Tea Time program for 2020, and it is a bridge between our 2020 programming theme, The Other Through Your Eyes, and our 2021 programming theme, The Work Left to Do. And so today we have a panel assembled to give us an understanding of some of the issues of justice as they appear on a global or national scale, and then also what they look like on a local scale. So with us today, we have Elizabeth Andersen, who is an expert in international human rights law, international criminal law, and transitional justice. She serves as the executive director of the World Justice Project, and I shall leave it to her to speak a little bit more about the World Justice Project's work in a moment. Betsy has more than 20 years of experience in the international legal arena, having served previously as the director of the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative and its Europe and Eurasia division. And prior to her current role, she served as executive director of the American Society of International Law and as executive director of Human Rights Watch's Europe and Central Asia division. Also with us today is Leila Sadat. She is the James Carr Professor of International Criminal Law at the Washington University of Law in St. Louis. She is the director of the Whitney R. Harris World Law Institute and special advisor on crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court prosecutor. And our final guest is Eddie Sundquist, who began serving as the mayor of Jamestown on January 1st, 2020, so 11 months and 2 days ago. Eddie has been a champion for human rights through a variety of paths, including as a middle school science teacher and as a practicing attorney. And so I am so thrilled that all three of you could be with me today for this conversation. So Elizabeth, we're going to have you start us off talking about the World Justice Project, please.
Sure, great to be here, and greetings everyone. So as Kristen mentioned, I am the director of the World Justice Project, which is a small NGO based in Washington with offices in a number of countries around the world, and works to advance the rule of law. This is one way in which we talk about these justice issues as issues of rule of law. And the WJP, as we refer to it, was established about a dozen years ago to advance this concept of the rule of law, first and foremost by bringing definitional rigor and data and evidence to it. So this is a concept that has been bandied about for millennia and resonates in every legal culture in the world, and yet we don't have a very firm definition of it. And so the World Justice Project was established to really tackle that challenge, to develop a universally recognized and resonant definition, and quite importantly, to develop a methodology for measuring it. And so I thought I'd share with you all today that definition and our measurement tool and some of the data on the United States, just to get our conversation going. So if you'll bear with me, I'll share my screen and run through a few slides that illustrate this work. Let's see. Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yep.
Wonderful. Okay. So as I mentioned, our first effort at the World Justice Project was to really define this concept. And we were not working with a blank slate. As I mentioned, this is an idea that is present in every legal culture in the world. And we drew on those legal precedents and international law and international norms to develop a definition, embedded it with experts all over the world, identifying really 4 pillars of this concept of the rule of law. And they are accountability, both of public and private actors, just laws that are clear, knowable to the citizens, stable, that they're applied evenly and they protect fundamental rights, open government, that encompasses things like the laws are, again, accessible enacted and administered in a fair and efficient manner through processes that are accessible to the public. And finally, accessible, impartial dispute resolution. These are ideas around an independent judiciary. So those are the broad themes of our definition. We then, on that basis, worked to develop a methodology for measuring it. We have a saying around our office: to change it, you need to measure it. And so we worked with econometricians in particular to develop and apply statistical methodology to this challenge of measuring a multifaceted idea of good governance, like the rule of law. So we developed a methodology for measuring the rule of law called the Rule of Law Index. And we publish a Rule of Law Index report annually that measures the rule of law now in 128 countries. Next year, it'll be 140 countries. We're slowly covering the globe. And the index measure divides those 4 pillars really in 8. The 8 pillars that you see here, 8 different factors of the rule of law that we have identified and look to develop measurement of. And the top 4 are ways in which the rule of law really constrains government. These are things that reflect things that the government can't do, or that are constraints on government powers. And the bottom 4 are really relate more to constraints on citizens, and also things that government is supposed to deliver to citizens as part of a rule of law society. So how do we go about measuring those factors? We divided them even further. So the 8 factors are divided into 44 sub-factors. So within constraints on government powers, for example, that includes things like the extent to which the legislature is a check on government, the judiciary is a check on government, whether there are independent audit functions or inspectors general, as we often think about them here in the United States, on government powers. So those checks and balances, we measure, we break them down in the different dimensions of that factor, constraints on government powers, and roll up into the overall score for that dimension. And each of the 8 factors is broken down that way. As I mentioned, we're now doing this study in 128 countries. We develop measures of countries' performance in each of those 8 factors and 44 sub-factors through surveys. And this is an important piece of this approach, is that we aren't looking at the laws on the books. We are looking at the laws in practice and how they're experienced by ordinary citizens in every country. So we survey 1,000 households in every country, and groups of experts, practitioners, legal practitioners and other practitioners in key areas of government in each of the countries. And we ask them questions about how the law works that relate to each of those 8 factors and 44 sub-factors. Over 500 questions in all that are rolled up into scores for each country on these factors. Here you see some pictures of the surveys being conducted all over the world. Most of the surveys are conducted in local language in person, as you can see here. In some more developed countries like the United States, we're able to use online technology to conduct the surveys online and get a statistically robust sample that way. But in most places, it's an in-person survey. So what do we learn from this data collection? We've been doing it now for 10 years, so we can begin to see trends across the globe and across time. Here you can see the top 10 and the bottom 10 countries in our 2020 index. You'll see that the top 10 are mostly countries in Europe and mostly developed countries. The United States fell to number 21 this year in our global index. It was the first year that it had fallen out of the top 20. And then the bottom performers are on the right there. Each country is given a score between 0 and 1. And that's what you see in these columns. And then we can track the change in percentage terms and then the global rank as well. Here you get a snapshot of some of the big movers up and down globally in our 2020 index. The yellow to orange are countries that are going down in their score, with orange being the steeper decline. And those that are in the blue shades are those that are improving, with the darker blue being those that are improving the most. One striking score here is Ethiopia was, I think, our top mover, a positive mover last year. And if folks are watching the news, things have taken a negative turn there recently. And that underscores an important thing that we find in this data, is that no country ever achieves the rule of law, and that it's constantly changing in many directions.
And there certainly were some surprises, at least in the coloring on that for me, that some countries you do not traditionally think of as strong in the rule of law are in the blue, and some that you might think would be stronger are yellow or oranger.
Right, right. Now let me underscore that the shading is not their overall score, but it's whether they're improving or declining.
Right.
So it's all relative, as we often say,
Of
where
course.
you're starting from. What we do see globally, unfortunately, is a decline in the rule of law. More countries declining in their overall score than improving. And that's a persistent trend over the last 5 years. Moreover, the areas among those 8 factors, the 3 factors that seem to be driving this trend are constraints on government powers, absence of corruption, and fundamental rights. So in the solid bar there, you can see the percentage of countries in orange that declined in the last year, in greenish blue, the countries that improved. So for constraints on government powers, for example, 41% declined, 22% improved. And the hash bars reflect the 5-year trends. So again, more countries declining in each of these 3 areas than improving over that period. And that's a worrisome trend that we are tracking very closely. I should say also that in each of these areas, we are particularly concerned about the impact of the COVID pandemic, which is exacerbating some of these trends in many countries. And we're anxiously awaiting our 2021 index to see how steeply that decline has played out over this year. All this data can be played with on our website, and I'd encourage people to do so. I think it's more fun than my kids' computer games. And you can slice and dice countries by factor and compare them to other countries in their region or income group, and look at different factors and sub-factors. I thought I'd just share a few slides that show the United States, and maybe that frames a discussion that we can have about some of the justice issues in this country. So some factors, the United States performs very, very well. Here's an example on open government. The US is a global leader. So if you look, here's the open government factor. The sub-factors are whether the laws are publicized, whether there's right to information, whether there's civic participation, and whether there are complaint mechanisms. And in each of these 4 areas, the US, you can see that little triangle off to the right, the US performs above, way above the global average and above even the regional average. Its regional group is the Western European and North American group. So the US is a strong performer on this factor. But if we look at some other factors, it's a mixed picture. So for example, here in fundamental rights, on some issues, the US is a very strong performer. So for example, in the 4th sub-factor there, freedom of opinion and expression is guaranteed. There, the US is above both the global average and the regional average. But if we look at the very first sub-factor on this page, equal treatment and absence of discrimination, And there, quite markedly, the US is below not only its regional group, but also the global average. And indeed, if you look at the global rank number on the left there, the US on this measure is 96th out of 128 countries. So that's a pretty striking statistic for us to grapple with, and really focuses our attention. Overall, the US is relatively strong in its protection of the rule of law, yet this is a real weak spot that we can focus on. We see similar issues in looking at, these are more data on fundamental rights here. What maybe jumps out is the fundamental labor rights in the last factor on this page, where the US is again below the global average. It performs well on a number of the other measures here. If we look at how the justice system is working, the civil justice system and the criminal justice system, again here on a number of measures, the US does very well. So for example, on factor 7.3, the third one down there, it measures whether the civil justice system is free of corruption. There, the US scores very well, well above the regional average and the global average. But what jumps out, of course, is that first and second measure. The first is people can access and afford civil justice. There, the US falls below the global and regional average, is 109th out of 128 countries. And the next one looks again at the issue of discrimination in our civil justice system. There, the US scores, this is its lowest score in our index overall, and it scores 115th out of 128 countries globally, well below the global average. And finally, here, a similar issue you can flag in the criminal justice context. If you look at the fourth measure down here, it looks at criminal justice and its impartiality. There, the US ranks 88th out of 128 countries. Again, I want to underscore there are lots of these measures where the US performs very well. And I think that corresponds to our overall impression of the rule of law in the United States. I'm highlighting some of these outlier factors because they are so striking and they do focus our attention on the work to be done.
Yep.
Thanks very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Perfect. Thank you. So I wanted, in our time today, we're not going to have the opportunity to tackle lots of issues of justice. So I wanted to focus us in on a few of them. And I think I want to start with the fundamental rights question, because this is something certainly in the United States that came to a particular head this summer again, as we are moving forward. And so, Betsy and Leila, for you, let's start with perhaps the macro or the global thought process first, as when we are taking a look at equal treatment or discrimination through the World Justice Project lens, for example, what are the surveys picking up? What are they hearing about some of the challenges within that in terms of how people are treated?
Well, again, I encourage folks to look at our website because the actual surveys are there and people can actually look at the questions that go into this data, and it's quite interesting. But there are questions that ask hypotheticals about how somebody who is, for example, a minority, either racially, ethnically, religious, other dimensions of minority status, whether they would be treated in the same way as somebody who's in the majority in their interactions with the police or with the judiciary or with public authorities, with a public hospital, for example. Will they get the same treatment? And so these are some of the measures that we're picking up in the surveys that go into those scores.
And I think a follow-up question from my perspective is, I have to imagine that those questions, the answers to those questions also differ on who is amongst that 1,000 that is being surveyed for that. And so if you are in the minority, you are likely to have one perspective. And if you are in the majority of whatever that group is for that country, possibly a different perspective, depending on how involved you might be in that particular area. Does that ring true?
That's correct. We have not looked at the data closely in this way, but we are just starting a project to do so. And in our preliminary analysis, we've seen quite striking differences in the experience of minorities and majorities across the globe. In they're experiencing different rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
Our experience with justice institutions is quite different. And this holds again across many countries and different kinds of minority arrangements. It's quite interesting and striking.
So Eddie, one thing I think that plays into here is in Jamestown, certainly, and again, starting this summer, kind of a resurgence of a conversation locally about social justice issues, about racial justice issues, human rights issues in general. And so I know you have been reinvigorating the Human Rights Commission, and wanted you to talk a little bit about what was the genesis behind reinvigorating that, and how that work is starting off now.
So I think one of the things to think about is, at least from my perspective, when I hear things like, as Betsy had mentioned, about different types of corruption and different types of rule of law across the nation, having gone out and, when I was, as you mentioned, I was a teacher, I taught in Philadelphia, right? And I taught middle school students who would regularly come in the next day and say, their house was ransacked by the police, or, so-and-so bribed someone in order to get out of a drug charge, right? And, having experience globally too, going to places like Africa, right? Where you can easily slip an officer some money and all of a sudden someone's arrested, right? You look at those things and then you refocus on what's going on here in the United States, and we start to see that there is a complete resurgence of looking at civil rights and looking at human rights across this nation. We went through decades where there was fighting to provide just basic human rights, basic voting rights, basic rights from the government. And we seem to continue to go in a cycle in this country. We see times when we have increased, expanded civil rights, human rights, and then it kind of falls off the wayside. And now more than ever, as you had mentioned, Kristen, we are seeing that resurgence across the country right now to look at, what are we doing as a nation? What are we doing in our communities? What are we doing with policing in particular? And how do we ensure that we are being provided, adequate civil rights? And it's a very interesting concept. Now here, even locally, we are looking at reviving, and we did revive human rights commissions. When you look across New York State has had a human rights commission that looks for issues of violations of human rights, whether that's in the workplace or whether that's renting a house or an apartment. And they've had this on the books for a very long time. And local governments would also have their own commissions to try to find and get rid of discrimination in communities. Many communities, Jamestown being one of them, got rid of that commission, more than a decade ago. And it kind of just went out in fashion, right? They're still there. I had the unique perspective as an attorney. I actually worked for the state's Division of Human Rights, prosecuting cases. And I'll tell you, in my time there, we saw less and less cases, less and less money being put into that court system to help root out issues and provide for discrimination. And so we let it slide. And now we're seeing kind of a nation and communities rise up saying, you know what, we've let it slide, but we've let it slide for too long, because we're seeing those same abuses come back into our communities. And we want someone to do something. We're not seeing it on a federal level, people reacting appropriately. Some states are kind of pushing back, but what you are seeing is the pushback in local communities on how do you root out this discrimination? How do you get back to a point where, you know, it doesn't matter your skin tone, it doesn't matter your gender, your sex, your beliefs, your ideas, your religion. Everyone should be treated equal if you're going to get an apartment, or if you're looking to get a job, or even if you're just walking the street and all of a sudden you're now accosted by a police officer. Those are things we're fighting to bring back. And you're now seeing a rise in local communities to push back on governments.
Well, and you raise an interesting point, I think, in terms of both interest and funding. And Leila, I'm thinking specifically of some of the challenges that the ICC has, and just sort of the international humanitarian law realm in general, of that the funding, they need to raise their own funding oftentimes in order to advance their prosecutions and move the ball forward. And what does that really say about our priorities? You know, is it we need to be having a more fundamental shift in what we're prioritizing?
Yeah, if I can take a step back, Kristen, that's a great question. And thank you for inviting me to join the conversation. It's really an honor. I hadn't seen the World Justice Projects. I guess I'd seen it when it was first rolled out, Betsy, and it's amazing to see what has been developed under your leadership and so many people. I think what was fascinating listening to Eddie and listening to your presentation is to see how some of the sliding back that we're talking about, you know, getting to the issue of priorities and budgets. You know, when we talk about human rights, we talk about sort of two baskets, basically, of rights: the civil and political rights and the economic, social, and cultural rights, sort of different, and the right to be free from discrimination cutting across all of that, right? It should be free from everything. And I think what's really fascinating is the World Justice Project statistics show that we continue to be really poor globally in terms of economic, social, and cultural rights, right? That the labor statistic figure really jumps out at you. We thought we were doing pretty well on civil and political rights, but it turns out that there's so much discrimination and so much difficulty for people of color that even those very basic rights, the right to be free from discrimination, right, the right to vote, we've really done a lot of sliding in that area. So I think it is, I wonder if it's one of the reasons that when we saw all the political conversation in our own country about the 2020 election and even, you know, the primary contests on the Democratic side, you had people really pushing the economic, social, and cultural rights, and others saying, whoa, we can't even vote. You know, we've got to go back to basics, and we've got to rebuild the criminal justice system, and we've got to be free from discrimination. On a global level, we're seeing the same thing, right? And I do think that the United States is not the world's dominant power by any stretch of the imagination anymore, but it certainly is it can play a pivotal role. I think Bill Burns said that in his recent book, right? It's not going to be the dominant power, but it's a pivotal power. And so the kind of sliding back we've seen in our own country is trickling. And I was fascinated, Betsy, by your statistics showing a global slippage in so many categories. Are we the cause? Are we a follower? Is it a contagion? Is it a different kind of virus, right? Nationalist governments in Europe, nationalist governments in the United States, Brazil, et cetera. So I think this really is something that we thought we were doing better, to go back to the local, right? We thought we were doing better. Maybe we could ease up on these human rights commissions. We had a great system. And in fact, we're finding that even these really core guarantees of equality before the law that are so important, we're not doing so great. I think the George Floyd video just catapulted all of us into this awareness of, oh my God, right? How is this even possible in 2020 when we thought we had sort of put some of that behind us? So I think I'll just stop there, but I think it's really interesting to see how this is all threading and tying together. And then, of course, when you're trying to stand up a new institution like the International Criminal Court and say, okay, now we want to make even more progress because we want to take on some of the most, sort of difficult to solve atrocity crime situations where all the rights are being violated all at once, right? We're seeing that's really hard to do when we can't even clean up our own backyards and guarantee very fundamental rights. So I think it's all really interesting how it ties together. And it's not a great time for human, I'm a teacher too, Eddie, right? I teach at the law school, and my human rights students in the spring were getting so depressed because they have to give a presentation on a human rights problem that this spring, I'm actually going to switch the exercise for them and have them give a presentation on a human rights success story. It may be harder to find it, but I sort of thought I don't want to be teaching a class where all the students walk out so hopeless, in the middle of a global pandemic that they just want to curl up in a corner and die. So, but I think we are all feeling this. It's a dark winter, as the president-elect suggested. So I think I'll stop there.
Well, and one of the thoughts that all of your comments have brought to mind for me is, are the right people involved in these conversations? So, for example, is one of the reasons why Jamestown thought the Human Rights Commission was no longer needed was because the people who were really being impacted negatively weren't coming to the table, weren't voicing their concerns, weren't part of that process. And you can imagine how that scales up on a global or national level as well. And so in terms of how do we make sure that the right people are engaged? And Betsy, I'm going to start with you because I have to imagine that there's some process that has gone into deciding who are the 1,000-ish or so people who are being polled in each country to really get a sense of what does that global view look like?
Right. Well, as to the methodology, it's a statistically representative sample. So there are all kinds of ways in which they make sure that the 1,000 we randomly select also correspond to the representation of different demographics in each jurisdiction. So that's the methodology there, and it goes very much to your point, which is that we're trying to get the broad community perspective on this, not what one sector feels or experiences. And I think your point is really well taken. It's really kind of one of our founding principles of the World Justice Project, which is this is not. And I apologize to all the lawyers on this call, but we feel very strongly that the rule of law is not a matter for judges and lawyers. It's really a community project. And so we have put multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity at the heart of our work, and working with a global consortium of scholars to help us think about this concept from a multidisciplinary perspective, both in understanding it and then how do we advance it. It needs to be a collaboration with folks in education, in public health, in religion, as well as in government and law. And certainly the pandemic has driven that home, right? The relationship between issues of rule of law and how public health is playing out in this context is pretty striking. And so building back better really needs to be a collaboration between the rule of law community and, among others, the public health community.
Well, and I would hope that I think one of perhaps the fundamental ways of moving this forward is that the rule of law is really in collaboration with everything. And so that's, I think if one of the takeaways from the World Justice Project statistics is that people people tend to think, as you just sort of framed the rule of law, is it's the lawyers and the judges, and it's not that it really, the laws affect everything that we do at every level, and basically how any one person navigates through their day will touch on numerous laws. And so making sure that everybody understands we all have a role in this.
Absolutely. One of our most active board members is an engineer from Tunisia, who was in the 2000s the president of the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, and through his work decided that engineering organizations needed not just to be thinking about technical matters that engineers care about, but also things like corruption, and that engineers in particular had a particularly valuable lens onto corruption in large construction projects, and could play a role in setting standards and advancing accountability in that field. And that needs to be multiplied across, all professions and disciplines.
Eddie, coming into your mayorship, and taking a look at some of the challenges that the city is confronting from an access to justice or from an open government perspective, what are you seeing that you think needs work, and is it work on both the citizenry side and the government side? So to bring those people back into the process as well.
Yeah, I think that it is collaborative, and Elizabeth, I take no offense to the fact that the rule of law needs to be a collaborative approach, and it's not just judges and attorneys. In fact, oftentimes judges and attorneys aren't really that good at making laws, right? And we need to have more of a community-based approach in order to make those changes. I think that there is a lot of issues when it comes to access to justice. And one of the things that was pointed out was the cost, right? If you are trying to, if you have been wronged and you are trying to get the justice system to help you, it's crazy for us to think, but you have to pay the justice system in order to hear your case. And in many cases, pay a lot of costs related to that. Many times it could amount to more than what the value was that you are asking the court to make a decision on. The same thing often goes for when I look at just apartments, right? And places where people can live, and looking at landlords trying to evict individuals. Right now, some states, not all, have preventions on evictions during this pandemic. But I can tell you that the number of landlords that call on a daily basis continues to multiply because they're not getting paid. They want to get into the court right away and they need to get people out, but where are you going to put them? So it goes the same way too. Sometimes it can be very difficult for a renter to try to sue the landlord over just basic repairs to keep a property up to date. And the other thing that we look at is even in the US, we have a very attorney-oriented system, right? So being able to provide and get access to good attorneys to represent you sometimes becomes a difficulty. If you're a public defender, our public defenders across this nation have thousands of cases that they're representing individuals just at one time. You look at the burnout that occurs for young attorneys that are public defenders, trying to really just, have a job that pays way less than a district attorney or an assistant district attorney in that system. It creates a problem that continues to multiply to have adequate access to justice, as well as adequate representation.
Leila, when we were chatting before we started today, you also mentioned a project that you were working on with related to gun violence. And I think this is probably a good time to talk about that as we're, sort of jumping off the access to justice part of it as a it's maybe slightly clunky segue into this, but
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I have a project on gun violence and human rights, trying to talk about the rights that are violated when people are in fear of being shot or actually are shot, or kids in schools that have to endure active shooter drills that are, potentially, I think, a form of cruel treatment, actually, depending on how, lifelike the active shooter drill is. There are a lot of human rights that are violated by gun violence. And I was interested, Betsy, circling back to your slides, that the United States did pretty well on right to life and security. And that is not an area where I would have given the United States strong marks. So maybe we can dig into that a little bit, because, we have 40,000 deaths a year. 60% of them are suicides. So maybe that's not a security problem, but it is a huge loss of life. And we have about 180,000 people shot every year in the United States. The statistics are horrifying, right? We're a world leader in gun violence in peacetime, a true global outlier. And we do see the same problems that were articulated, that it tends to hit people of color more seriously, that there is much more gun violence, much more likely to be shot by police, for example, if you're a Black or brown. There is also just more gun violence in neighborhoods in which minorities often live. It is a problem, though, that, as we saw from the Parkland shooting and other shootings, is afflicting even very affluent communities. So Betsy, maybe, and then I'll maybe come back to a little bit of what we think the solution is. Can you talk to me a little bit about that number? Because that kind of jumped out at me. I would have given us lower marks on that score.
Right. Well, we can dig in offline. We'll dig into the data. I just look at it really quickly, and it is higher than the global average for sure. But we score below our regional peers. So below, as you would expect, all the countries of Western Europe and North America. And globally, we rank 23rd out of 128 countries on that measure. So it's not as bad as we are on some of the discrimination measures, but it's, I think, nothing really to write home about. But I'd be happy to dig into the details, the underlying questions that are feeding that score, and maybe it's relevant for your project.
Yeah, no, that would be really interesting, because it is a crisis, right? It's a public health crisis, tying into, we have crisis upon crisis in the United States. Again, we're seeing the pandemic is hitting populations, communities of color much harder than it is other communities, because of reliance on public transportation, lack of access to healthcare. It ties into the social, economic, social, and cultural rights, because they don't have health insurance, or they're scared to go to doctors. It ties into immigration. So we're seeing a huge crash of the human rights protection, whatever's buttressing individuals' lives, especially when it comes to gun violence and the pandemic. I don't know if that answered your question, Kristen. So what we're trying to do about it, actually, is the first thing we're trying to do is say, stop focusing on the Second Amendment. There's nothing in the Constitution that prevents sensible gun regulation, right? Even Justice Scalia and the other justices of the court, when they decided in 2008, the Heller case, said reasonable gun regulation is possible. And we've seen from all of our peer countries, whether it be the UK or Australia or New Zealand or Switzerland, right? We know how to do it. They know how to do it, which is, universal background checks, and gun buybacks, you ban assault weapons, you have licensing and other requirements, right? Public health requirements. And yet there's a resistance to that based upon sort of a cultural attachment to the Second Amendment, as opposed to all the other human rights: the right to life, the right to security, the right to health, the right to an education, the right to culture, the right of association. And so a human rights commission could look at a question like that. I think the federal courts are not going to be a very fruitful place for human rights litigation, although there may be some. But and we recently received a grant from the Joyce Foundation to explore that. But I do think a human rights commission that looks at all the rights, not just at one right, but looks at all of the human rights, could be a possible avenue of exploring this and fixing this problem.
Yeah. So we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. And Leila, I actually wanted to, while we're letting them have the time to think and ask the question, there was something that you said I also wanted to jump off of, is that within the human rights world, we have spent a lot of time over this year talking about various rights with a COVID lens on it. We have talked about some of the Supreme Court cases that have come down that have impacted tribal sovereignty and LGBTQ rights and DACA recipients. And so we've taken a look at through these various lenses. Our audience is very familiar also with the international humanitarian law world, of which you live in an awful lot, and Betsy and I, over the last 18 months, have gotten to dabble in a little bit with the Jackson Center. And so I guess the question is, going off what you said, what is the right venue in terms of moving some of these human rights discussions forward? If we are not relying on the federal judiciary or something along that line, what do you see as some of the paths forward for this?
Well, I just loved what Mayor Eddy said, which is, and Eleanor Roosevelt said this: human rights begins at home, right? Human rights begins at home. American exceptionalism is literally killing us. It's literally killing us. And so I think starting locally is exactly the right place for the distressed citizen to start. And then I think, of course, what we've seen is some very interesting dialogues between the local and the global. For example, the Michael Brown's family, I live in St. Louis because I teach here, and this is where the Ferguson, Michael Brown shooting was. And that family went to Geneva and presented the evidence in front of the human rights bodies in Geneva of what had happened to Michael Brown. And so there is definitely a dialogue between the international community and the local and national community. So that, I think that dialogue is a very important component. As a lawyer, we do often think, as Betsy, we're going to sue somebody, we're going to have an inaction. And of course there are potentials there, but it's also important to change the way people think about the problems. And so, as I said, in the United States, we've had this fixation on the Second Amendment, the fixation on the language of the Constitution, without looking at the broader panoply of rights that were codified after the Second World War in response to the atrocities that have been committed in Europe. And so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it applies to Americans, right? The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the U.S. has ratified that treaty. So it's really important, I think, to see ourselves as part of the global community, not as exceptional and separate and apart, and to recognize that many of those rights are very, they apply to us, right? And they can apply in our Human Rights Commission in Jamestown, or we can fly to Geneva and have a conversation with similarly situated people from all over the globe. So they're not mutually exclusive. It's really important to understand that we are all one human family, which is what the rights really mean.
So actually, that's a lovely segue into a question that Nicole asks of Eddy. And Nicole asks, how does a human rights case come to the commission's attention? What are the channels available for ideas or cases to be considered?
So in New York State, there are two ways that those things come through. So it's like most things in the court system, it's the filing of a complaint, and it's either through a local commission or it's through the statewide body, the Division of Human Rights. those complaints are then investigated to see if there is enough to move forward with a full case on it. But essentially, if there is a view or if someone knows of, or there is an actual individual that is complaining of a human rights violation or some type of discrimination, they can file a complaint either with a local commission on human rights or with the statewide division of human rights.
Okay, great, thank you. And Betsy, we have a question from Helena for you. So because access to housing tends to affect where you're educated, your access to healthcare, jobs, and everything along that line, how much does that factor in, or is there any particular focus on that issue within the larger World Justice Project statistics?
The place in which we have looked at that most closely is in the area of civil justice and access to civil justice to resolve housing related disputes. We did a study a couple of years ago in 101 countries where we asked people, as part of this survey exercise, we did a special module where we asked people about their everyday legal problems. What kinds of problems do they have and how do they solve them? Who do they turn to? Do they get solutions? And what kinds of consequences do they have in their lives? And the findings, that's also on our website, the findings are pretty striking. Globally and also in the United States, about 50% of us have had a legal problem, an everyday legal problem in the last 2 years. And the overwhelming majority do not turn to lawyers and judges and formal institutions to solve those problems. Many people can't solve them, and these problems have very significant consequences in their lives, including almost 30% people report that they've had a stress-related health problem because of their legal problem, or about 25% have either lost their job or lost their housing because of their legal problem. So it has a ripple effect in people's lives, and housing issues were among the top 5 or 6, I think, globally and also in the United States in terms of the kinds of problems that people have. So it's absolutely a big issue that she's put her finger on there.
Well, and what I find interesting about that is I think that's also perhaps a unique perspective for people that type of access challenge, or that the housing in and of itself, you might tend to think of as sort of a siloed issue, and not really that it impacts, again, like all of the rule of law conversation in general, it impacts a wide variety of things to which you will have access, whether that be food, whether that be, ease of healthcare or medical access, education, I often hope people realize how intertwined all of these issues are. There's no such thing as a standalone issue anymore.
Yeah, the data definitely show a kind of cumulative effect of these problems, or a cascading effect in people's lives. So the same people have multiple problems and consequences, negative consequences in their lives as a result.
Mayor Sundquist, we also got a question for you of whether or not there is a particular application that one should submit to file for a human rights violation, or I think perhaps just a tad more granular in the process there. What is the way of initiating something like that?
Sure. So the local commissions usually have a form that they use for the statewide. There's an application that they do online with the Division of Human Rights. Many of the local commissions in New York State have an agreement or a memorandum with the state to help prosecute it, since the state has the ability to employ investigators as well as a full court system through that. But if an individual believes that that's the case, that there is discrimination, that they can either go directly to the Division of Human Rights, mostly through their website or by calling them or visiting them, or through a local commission, which will then refer it to the state commission.
Thank you. Leila, a question for you from our audience, and it's playing off some of the data that was in Betsy's presentation about some of the 5-year slide on some of these issues. So what are some of the areas, or perhaps even countries in particular, that the international humanitarian law community is paying attention to in terms of these are places in particular crisis or really areas of concern?
Well, Betsy's map was pretty impressive, right? It was just kind of, I'm trying to think, Egypt was showing improvement, for example, it was a little bit blue, right? But Egypt is also, I think, in your bottom 10. Afghanistan, the same thing. It showed a little bit of improvement, but it's actually in the bottom group. So most of the countries where you're talking about humanitarian crises that I worry about, crimes against humanity or anything like that, those kinds of situations, generally you're talking about a conflict situation. And it could be the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which had 19 different militia groups and a government that wasn't in particular control. And so the International Criminal Court, for example, might be investigating rebel, basically factions within that country. In some other countries that had been doing better, I'm thinking of Uganda. We really thought the core of the problem there was the Lord's Resistance Army. The ICC was actually investigating. In fact, they finished a trial and were waiting for a judgment in the Angwin case with respect to, and northern Uganda had become relatively peaceful, but now we're having problems coming from the current president, who is allegedly, I don't know, Betsy may know more about this than I do, but we're hearing allegations of torturing a political opponent and basically trying to cling to power at all costs. And so that raises a whole different, where it's governments in power that are creating the crisis. It's a very different issue than when it's sort of rebels operating on the territory or militia operating on the territory of governments. And so the ICC is looking at both sets of cases. It's looking at the kinds of cases that are a little easier, where the government in power is actually being plagued by these militia and is very happy, or at least tolerant, of ICC intervention. And then situations where it's not so, where the government in power is actually being targeted because it is, there are serious, incredible allegations that ICC crimes are being committed. And Burundi, for example, was one. Philippines was one, where their war on drugs was resulting in thousands of extrajudicial executions. And those two states withdrew from the treaty regime because the ICC was trying to investigate the commission of those crimes. So that's the kind of human rights concern. That's an off the scale. We don't want to get to that level of dysfunction where it's the government itself that's actually accused of perpetrating the atrocities, because then you're really looking at a very difficult set of problems.
So as we are wrapping up, Betsy, one final question for you, because I did play around with the various scales and slides and characteristics. I had a lot of color-coded fun for a day or so. When will the 2021 report be available? I'm just curious as to how long does it actually take to compile this information and that?
Yeah. Well, it's an annual exercise, and we start data collection almost immediately upon publishing the last one. This year, the exercise has been complicated by the pandemic, as you can imagine. You saw those pictures of surveys being conducted in person. We can't do that right now, and so that has put us back, but we are anticipating publishing the 2021 index in September of this coming year.
Nice. Okay, great. Well, I want to thank Betsy, Leila, and Eddie for being with us today. I really appreciate that. I also would like to thank our audience for joining us for tea today. Although this is our final tea time of 2020, we do have one more program. So I will highlight that here now. Next Wednesday, 2 Wednesdays from now, December 16th at 3 p.m., we will be speaking again with Professor Ned Foley. As the second part of our Electoral College election, what the heck just happened discussion. So we'll be talking about the recent US election, what people are saying about the Electoral College post-election, and what future elections in the United States might look like from that perspective. So if you would like to join us for this conversation, this is a webinar, so it requires just a special registration. It is still free, but please go to the Jackson Center website, roberthjackson.org, to sign up for this webinar, and you'll get the Zoom link for that. And again, Eddie, Leila, and Betsy, thank you so very much for adding your voices to today's conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Kristen. It was great.
Thanks for having me.